Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a round 3 game from the 75th Tata Steel chess tournament between the current world champion Viswanathan Anand, who's playing the white side, against Fabiano Caruana. The game enters the Ruy Lopez, and more specifically we have the closed system. And you'll know as soon as e5 is defended, this possibility for picking up the bishop pair is present, and so a3 addresses this. If knight a5, you tuck the bishop back. Black castles, and now the typical queen-knight journey in this closed system, namely knight d2, f1, and either e3 or g3. What's quite common on the black side in response to this is rook to e8 and bishop to f8, which is what is played in the game. Rook f8, or excuse me, rook e8 to have a better influence on the center. Bishop f8 to not only get out of the rook's way, but to be in a position to watch over potentially weakened kingside dark squares. What am I talking about? I'm talking about if you could envision this knight on e3 or g3, it observes f5. f5 might need to be watched over with g6. If g6 is played, dark square weaknesses occur. The bishop is in a good spot to watch over them. So that's what we have with these next sequence of moves for both sides. Knight goes for his little journey. Black regroups with the rook and bishop. h6 is inserted to rule out knight g5 stuff, so there's no converging on f7. It is something that could have been played one move sooner. Instead of knight f1 on this move 11, knight g5 could be played, but after rook e7 to defend, looks a little bit awkward, but soon enough we'll have h6 with tempo. The knight runs away, and again, now the lot has been accomplished. So instead it's just knight f1, h6, knight e3, eyeing that d5 square. The bishops are now in tension with one another, and they are immediately exchanged. And we have the rook recapturing. There is no structural change with f takes e. It's something to consider since it does rule out the knight's prospects. But I believe it's a bit more commonly seen should this rook remain on that f8 square. If it were still on f8, I think it's all the more appealing to be capturing with the f-pawn. Not the case here. Instead, it's just rook takes, and now knight d5. So knight takes up a central post, and this is something that struck me. Well, I was a little bit curious about this particular position. When I saw that the knight eventually landed on that d5 square, something kind of stuck out to me. And I'm wondering if something is maybe sticking out to you right now. If you'd like to, pause the video, see if anything kind of comes to mind, and I'm just going to get right to it. The thing that struck me as a little bit odd is when you just do some number counting and you look at how many moves it took for the knight to get to that d5 square, and also what squares it traveled on to get to that square. d2, f1, e3, d5. Clearly, we have that knight taking 4 steps to get to that central post. Quick question, why not take 2? c3 and d5. Do you have an answer for it? This is something I ended up having to scratch my head over a little bit, and one thing that I kind of came up with, I don't know how accurate it is, but nevertheless I'll share it. When this knight is playing to d2, when it's playing to f1, when it's playing to e3, there's one thing that it's never doing along that little journey. Although it takes a little bit longer, one thing that it's never doing is obstructing a potential white plan, namely c3 and d4, a central expansion. That's always in white's back pocket. Depending on what black does, maybe that will be an effective plan, but nevertheless, along that exaggerated journey, that more lengthy journey, it took a couple more moves to do, but maybe depending on what black does in response, in that small group of moves right there, maybe the c3 and d4 plan would turn out to be effective. Anyhow, just some food for thought. If you just go strictly by the numbers, it looks kind of crazy. Why not just take 2 steps to get there? But there's certainly many more things going on behind the scenes, so to speak. Anyhow, the knight at this point, once it lands on that d5 square, it is immune from capture since black would just be hit with the fork. So rook drops back, and now c4 to reinforce it. The knight drops back to allow the c pawn to contribute, playing to c6 to kick that knight away, or even just challenge a pawn or knight on that d5 square. Bishop d2 reminded me of a line out of the Catalan opening, one where the bishop has the potential to pin the c pawn to the queen, and that is present in this position, but it's addressed by black right away. First taking on d5, and now playing c6, challenging the d5 point. White is trying to hold on to it with queen to b6, or excuse me, queen to b3. We have c takes d, and now queen takes, or c takes d, queen takes d, and now knight to d7. This is these are things that I often like to point out, and that is potential structural changes. What to do if black plays c5. These are important details if you're looking to improve. Now would be a time to just quickly pause the video, see if you could figure out what might be a good plan for white at this point. Should we be seeing something as illogical as c5? It could have been played in one shot, but having this little baby step, if we're having now this structural change, what do you do as white? What's something that you could be coming up with? Something that I'm seeing, just getting right to it, something that I'm seeing is a4. Undermining this b5 pawn. Why is this important? It's important because it grants this knight access to the c4 square. Why is that important? It's a great domino effect. That's important because it puts pressure on a base point, d6. And by putting pressure on a base point, one way to translate that is you are constraining at least one black piece to the defense of that square. And when your opponent's pieces are constrained to the defensive pawns, they could be setting themselves up. You're not quite sure how it'll work out, but you're setting yourself up in some way for the tactic of deflection, or just one of your pieces not being able to really be a piece and be aggressive and attack you. If they're having to defend, oftentimes they just can't be doing both things. So the main thing here is that a4 would grant the knight access to c4 because the b5 pawn cannot be maintained. After a4, you can't maintain this pawn. Playing here is not a defense. The rook on a8 is unprotected. So what do? You try something like b4. c4 is now made available. You could be dropping the bishop back. You could be getting the knight to c4. There is a lot more to it. Moves, namely involved, moves that might be included are something like a5 to make sure that when you do get a knight to c4, it's not a knight that could be easily challenged with knight d7 to b6. So you might want to take that possibility away from black. There are other things black could be doing in the meantime. Let me just run with this variation after b4. Let's just say a5 right away. Knight d7, let's say bishop comes back, and now something like f5. Black could be trying to gain some space on the king side. But, this knight is going to be very strong, and there is still the possibility. It has to come with some care, but there is the potential break for even c3 to still stir up some trouble. Could turn out to be a quite interesting game, but my main point here, I guess without getting too much further ahead of myself, is that this a4 move is certainly something to be considering to vacate the c4 square for the knight. How to react to this structural change, I think a4 is, again, something to consider. But in the game we have c takes d, queen takes d, knight d7, looking to eventually overtake the d5 square with the knight f6 or b6. Some logical moves getting on open files is Anand with rook a to c1, queen to b8, preparing to double with rook c3. The knight hits the queen runs away. Queen b7, and now the rooks are doubled. Rooks are challenged, h3, flight square for the king. A pair of rooks come off, and now white, as was the case throughout this whole game, is still just slightly better. And in this case, one of the main reasons for that is because of the control over the c-file, which is not something that black can regain. So what must black do is a big question. Black must do something like d5. They have to stir up some trouble. Just sitting back and trying to defend is not the way to go. Just crawling up in a ball and hoping for the best is not the way to go. This queen is looking to just infiltrate and put pressure on the queenside pawns. Action has to take place right away. d5 is it. e4 is getting hit 3 times. We have knight takes e, d takes e, and now d4. Very important detail, of course. You don't take the pawn, you're dead. Queen is overloaded, having to defend both knight and bishop. Not the way to go. Instead, it's d4, reinforcing this knight. Black is now just centralizing the queen. White is reinforcing d4, and black is challenging the one piece that is in their territory. Or excuse me, yeah, their territory, the one on e5. The knight runs away to g4, and we just have a rook lift, watching over f6 and looking out for the pawns that are most vulnerable. a6, still watching over e4. Knight takes knight, rook takes knight, and now king to h1. White would like to play queen to c6, but doing that right away fails tactically to bishop h2, and the queen is dead. So king h1 sidesteps that idea. Bishop e6, and now the rook is there to watch over the c6 square. It's important to note that white does well even in a position where there aren't any queens on the board. The resulting endgame without the queens is one where white just has the more active rook, and this rook will be on the defensive. So we have bishop e7, queen c7, hitting the bishop, rook to e6, and now queen to b8, giving check. One of the, I guess, downsides with the rook e6 and then the recapturing on that f6 square is that the back rank is a bit more vulnerable, and this is something that white is looking to exploit right away. Getting to b8 and soon enough playing to c8, the king basically just has to run for the hills here. There's not a great alternative. King h7 is what was played. If you go to f8, you're going to get hammered with rook c8, and you just can't defend it. We have this that is not long off, this bishop d2 to b4 move. A move such as queen to d6 is getting shut down with a strong move such as d5. The rook is hit, paves the way for bishop c5 stuff. For example, the queens come off, but still, bishop c5, the bishop's dead. So avoid self-pins, in short, and just run. So king h7, rook c8 anyway, looking for that h8 square. And now, well, up until this point, it's, again, always been white slightly better, but now here comes pretty much the big slip right here, bishop to d6. This is going to now run into some trouble. And keep in mind that Caruana at this point is a bit down on time. These aren't, I don't know how accurate the times are, but he has roughly 5 or 6 minutes at this point to complete time control. He still needs to make his 40th move, and he's still working on what to do for move 34. So bishop d6 is played, rook h8. The king is now running to g6, and now queen to g8. Do you see the threat here? The threat is rook takes h6. This pawn is pinned. This pawn is hit twice. At first I was thinking maybe there is, well, not at first, but one of the things I was seeing is why not try to play bishop e7 and then f6. I thought the main threat would be just rook h7 and then this pawn needed to be defended, but queen g8 is threatening. Queen g8 is threatening, just rook takes pawn with check, so the king needs to just pack up and run. He's running now to f6, but after rook h7, there's no way to defend the g7 pawn. So this king just did a little ring around the rosy, I guess you could say. g8 to h7, g6. It's just kind of going in circles. There's just no defense at this point. The g pawn drops. Queen h5 to defend, but after bishop g5 check, there is no capture because once again, white is taking advantage of these pins in the position. King runs, queen grabs another pawn, and after the recapture, black resigns, being down 2 pawns in a simplified endgame, and soon enough it's going to be even more simplified. For example, let's say king to e8, we would just have rook to f6. The rooks are going to have to come off, and in this endgame, all the same, white is, again, 2 pawns up. There should be no problems at all. These 2 pawns are going to, by force, create a pass pawn. The king is going to get towards the center, and that's going to be game over. There was some resistance in the form of what, instead of bishop to d6, what might have been, what might have been better is bishop to g5. Well, not might. Bishop g5 would have been better. And if rook h8, only move, queen g8, and if there's ever, one thing to point out, if there is ever bishop takes bishop, there could be pawn takes, and now the pressure against this point could be defended with queen takes pawn. So this idea of bringing the bishop to this g5 square is to, be in a spot where if this bishop isn't around, okay, well, there could be queen takes pawn to defend. And the other thing is that black is stripping the white king of actually a defender. This bishop is actually defending against potential perpetual checks. For example, let's just run with still queen to g8. The only difference here that we're looking at is the bishop's decision to play to g5 instead of what was played in the game to d6. After queen g8, we could have bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, and after a move such as queen to c4, we have now the threat of what? We have the threat of queen c1, giving check, king h2, followed by queen to c7. For example, rook here, it's just not working out. There's check here, basically just making use of the c1 and c7 squares. That would be perpetual check. There is no way to go in this direction because black would end up winning. There would end up being a rook check on the f-file, so that certainly would not be the way to go. I believe that there would be some save. I don't know that Anand would have allowed that type of perpetual check, but at the very least, this bishop to g5 move would have been a better direction to go. But not the case in this game. Instead, it was bishop d6. The king ends up running scared. A couple pawns drop, and this is just completely one endgame for Anand. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.